Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. I'm very honored to have Mary Ruefle stop by the studio today while she's in town, brought here by Portland State University and Tin House for a joint sponsored event. Mary Ruefle is a poet, essayist, and erasure artist. She's the author of 10 books of poetry, most recently Trances of the Blast from Wave Books, a book of fiction entitled The Most of It, and a comic book, Go Home and Go to Bed. Her one-of-a-kind erasures of 19th century texts have been exhibited in museums and galleries, and one has been reproduced as the book A Little White Shadow, also from Wave Books. Ruefle is the recipient of many honors, including a Guggenheim, a National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship, and a Whiting Award. She's also the author of Madness, Rack, and Honey, a collection of her lectures that was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism, a book that poet Matthew Dickman says is not just for poets, but for anyone interested in the human heart, the inner life, the breath exhaling a completion of an idea that will make you feel changed in some way. This is a Desert Island book, and Publishers Weekly adds that Madness, Rack, and Honey is profound, unpredictable, charming, and outright funny, which seems like a great description of Mary Ruefle herself. Welcome to Between the Covers, Mary Ruefle.
Thanks, David. I'm happy to be here.
Well, when did you first know that you were a poet or wanted to be a poet?
I started writing as a child, and I wrote poems in elementary school beyond the normal school assignments. So I would write poems at home in my room. And there's that. And then I continued to write in high school, but I was also writing stories. But I think I was too young to consciously know or make a decision what I was going to be when I grew up is a question I still ask myself every day.
Was there ever an alternate? I wanted to be an astronaut before I wanted to be a poet.
There's so many things I wanted to be. You know, I've always been a frustrated visual artist. I would have loved to have been a painter. I come from, I'm old enough that painting was what I wanted to be. If I were young now, I think doing installations and non-genre specific art would definitely be up my alley. There was a time I wanted to be an actress. There was a time I wanted to be, a florist, a physicist. They're just whimsical daydreams that I still have.
Yeah.
But this is, and doing the erasure work has been a way for me to go back to those visual yearnings, using image, and whiteout's a form of paint, after all. It covers things opaquely. So consciously, it evolved. At one point, you realize that this is an activity that you are engaged in and will always be engaged in. There's no one point. There's no one point. But I was doing this as a kid. For other writers have an experience of taking a class in college and their life is forever changed. I don't have that experience.
Do you have any experiences with individual poems or poets that early on grabbed you?
Oh, yes, I very much do. And I write about this in Madness, Rack, and Honey. I'm not sure what essay, maybe the I Remember one. Very much so. There was an anthology when I was a child, which I still have a copy of, by Louis Untermeyer, who was a major figure in the poetry world and letters, I think in the 40s and 30s, 40s and 50s. And it was called The Golden Book of Children's Verse or something like that. And this is a book I devoured. I devoured it. I read it again and again and again and again. And then when I was in high school, there was a white anthology of European poetry and translation. That book was a similar book I devoured and read again and again and again and again. So my first introduction to poetry was foreign poetry, in predominantly European, in translation. I didn't come into poetry through contemporary American poetry at all. That was something I read much later. So I could cite those two anthologies as important. And the other really seminal moment for me, I've mentioned elementary school and high school, but the really big thing happened in junior high. I had a knee operation, and I had a cast from foot to thigh, and it was summer, and I couldn't move around much, and it was very hot to be outside. We lived in Nebraska. There was a basement. The basement's always cooler. We had what was called in those days a rec room down there. That's where the TV was, and a beat-up old sofa. And I would hang out in the rec room and probably, I don't remember, watch TV and eat ice cream or something, whatever kids do when they're bored. And my sister was in college, and she was home from college, and she had an anthology of the British Romantics, and Keats and Shelley and Coleridge and Wordsworth. And I remember either she gave me the book to read or she read a poem out loud to me. All I know is she was at an ironing board ironing. I can see her ironing at an ironing board. And I read a poem or she read it. And that moment forever changed my life. It was Ozymandias by Shelley. And I fell in love with this poem. I completely, utterly fell in love with that poem. And I would read it again and again and again and again, and my mind would explode every time I read it. So that's the junior high moment that connects the other two.
Maybe this is a good time to hear the poem 13. If I remember correctly, that one has...
Yeah, that's true. That's how astute of you. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that was the summer. 13. I was 13, my whole leg in a cast. It was like lugging a piece of pottery around, and every human face I knew took a pen and wrote on me. I used to lie in bed at night and read it, and when I healed, they broke it. I walked away without a shard. Paula, Carl, whoever you are, I will not be there to drink the water beside your bed. I read 3,000 books, and then I died.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Mary Ruefle, and you're listening to Between the Covers. In Madness, Rack, and Honey, Mary, you declare at the beginning an allegiance to wonder over knowledge. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What does that mean for you?
I would rather wonder than know, and it makes it more and more difficult to be alive on Earth in these times when your inclination is to wonder rather than to know. I suppose the example that comes to mind is, it used to be if you were having dinner with people and someone said, "Who's the fastest animal on Earth?" everyone, an amazing conversation would ensue. And now someone pops their phone out and looks up the answer, and that breaks my heart. This idea of access to answers and information, believing that they're all the truth, which is not always true. I really, really don't like it when people look things up on their iPhones. I would rather talk about, sometimes, of course, I'm no idiot. The encyclopedic nature of the information that's available is fantastic. But I still would rather wonder than know. And I think wondering is a way of inhabiting and lingering. There seems to be more dwelling, to dwell, inhabit, and linger. I'm interested in those things. And you can do that when you don't know. We tend to, as human beings, our impulse is once we know, once we have the answer, we move on. So we're constantly moving from one thing to another, and I would rather inhabit the question or dwell. For me, that is the place that I want to live in. I have an encyclopedia at home, and it never occurred to me there was anything wrong with it till my friend pointed out it was Encyclopedia Britannica from 1910, and it might be a little outdated, but I still look things up. I still look things up in it, and it's amazingly detailed. I was looking up the Belgian Congo, and I mean, because it was the Belgian Congo in 1910, and of course I know it no longer is, and it was like 30 pages almost transcribing a meeting in Parliament to decide, or something was for independence, or for, it was so detailed. It was astounded me. I don't have the facts quite right, but...
Would you think that facts and certainty are in opposition to poetry and art?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Facts and certainty are not the business of an artist. You know, the business of an artist is to pay attention. And by paying attention, you're inhabiting a moment, because you're entering a moment, even though time is passing. And facts and certainty, I think, would have to do with a larger scope of time. And facts and certainty are always changing. I mean, they're constantly changing. We're given medical facts, I mean, that become untrue 25 years later.
Right.
So...
well, you say at the end of one poem, I think, something of the sort of, I detest exactness. And I wonder if maybe that is partly pointing to like a dishonesty in it being exacted at all.
Well, part of me is dishonest because I also am an extremely exacting person. I say in a poem that I despise exactness, but if you visited my apartment, your overall impression would be, here is a person who is obsessed with exactness. I have to admit that, but we're all contradictory people, and I am no different. I'm very full of contradictions.
In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today to poet and essayist Mary Ruefle. A couple weeks ago, Mary, I was at a reading of Mark Doty, and he is a big fan of Walt Whitman, and he was describing going to a used bookstore to pick up a copy of Leaves of Grass to bring to teach, and he didn't open it before he taught, and he went and opened it, and there were all these writings by a previous reader, and there's a section in Leaves of Grass where it says, what is the grass? And the person in the margin writes, it's grass. And he remembers being very mad that this person would write something that way. But then he realized that this reader had a certain deep faith in the power of language, that this word grass corresponded to the thing grass and everything that grass was. And that poets were really, they were more oriented to the ways in which language didn't correspond to the mystery.
Yes.
And that's why Walt Whitman had to write 300 pages to answer this question.
Yes.
Does that resonate with you?
Well, first of all, I love Walt Whitman. And I love marginalia. And I think Mark was very lucky to find this book. I love finding marginalia in old books. And that's a wonderful page. I would have framed it and put it in a frame. What is grass? It's grass. Oh, well, thinking about that, my mind goes a million different places. I could tell you about some framed marginalia I have in my apartment, or I could also tell you about my Whitman sampler. Well, I'll go here in direct relation to Mark Doty's comment on that. There is a famous Buddhist lesson. It goes way back. I can't tell you right off the top of my head where it originates, but it goes like this. When I first began to study, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. After I had studied for some while, I realized that mountains were no longer mountains and rivers were no longer rivers. And after I had studied for a very long time, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. And I've always loved that. And I think that it's true not only for spiritual seekers, but for artists and people invested in creativity and language. We go through, when we're kids, grass is grass, and then grass is, we don't know what grass is, and it's a great mystery, and it becomes a million other things, and perhaps when we're old, it's grass is just grass again. I don't know, but it's that little quote, which of course I botched, but has to do with metaphor, and a central issue of metaphor, because I think that the central area where you say mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers has to do with the power of metaphor to connect things. A belief that, has to do with metaphor.
I'm not sure why this particular poem comes to mind, but would you be willing to read How I Became Impossible?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. How I Became Impossible. I was born shy, congenitally unable to do anything profitable, to see anything in color, to love plums, with a marked aversion to traveling around the room, which is perfectly normal in infants. Who wrote this were my first words. I did not like to be torched. More snow fell than was able to melt. I became green-eyed and in due time traveled to other countries where I formed opinions on hard, cold, shiny objects and soft, warm, nappy things. Late in life, I began to develop a passion for persimmons and was absolutely delighted when a postcard arrived for the recently departed. I became recalcitrant, spending more and more time with my rowboat. All my life, I thought polar bears and penguins grew up together, playing side by side on the ice, sharing the same vista, bits of blubber, and innocent lore. One day, I read a scientific journal. There are no penguins at one pole, no bears on the other. These two, who were so long intimates in my mind, began to drift apart, each on his own flow, far out into the glacial seas. I realized I was becoming impossible, more and more impossible, and that one day it really would be true.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Mary Ruefle, and you're listening to Between the Covers. I would love to talk to you about contradiction. That poem ends in a contradiction, as many of your poems delve into them. And it feels like the realm of contradiction is often in the world of religion. And you use a lot of religious and mythological imagery and allusions in your poems. But it seems like in America there's this sort of binary where if you aren't actually a practicing religious person, the only other option seems to be a secular humanist, someone who raises reason and elevates reason and believes that the opposite of knowledge is ignorance, not wonder. But somehow it feels like you've pointed to a lesser known or spoken of third way of using the language of religion, wonder, mystery, contradiction, without necessarily espousing religion. Can you talk about how those images and themes are operating for you in poems?
Knowledge is wonder to me, I suppose, or a form. I've been interested in religion as far back as I can remember. Again, it starts in high school when you may be raised in one religion or another. I happen to have been raised Catholic, not fervently. I never went to Catholic school, but that was an early, obviously, implant. But in high school, if you're a reasonably intelligent person, creative person in high school, you begin to be curious about world religions. I remember in high school, I said, okay, I'm going to read the Bhagavad Gita, I'm going to read the Upanishads, I'm going to, study Buddhism, I'm going to read the Quran, which I actually read in high school, and of course should reread it. But it was simply, I don't know where that came from, but it was always there, and it has always been there. Actually, I was rereading Kafka's letter last night in the hotel room. I picked it up at Powell's. Of course, it's been years since I read it, and a friend of mine had mentioned it, so I bought it on sale at Powell's yesterday, and I was reading it last night, and it's only about 100 pages, and I came across, may I share it with you? Because this is an example of what struck me as a person. He says, I have worried for as long as I can recall so deeply about asserting my spiritual existence that nothing else has ever mattered to me. Now, I obviously copied that because it spoke to me and resonated with me, and I felt the same way, and I thought that was astonishing. I have worried for as long as I can recall so deeply about asserting my spiritual existence that nothing else has ever mattered to me. And he also, on the same page right before, which made me laugh, the second did not. It sort of sent shivers down my spine, but this made me laugh. It's taken out of context from the middle of a sentence. He goes, my not altogether hopeless analytical ability. Which, if you know, Kafka, was trained as a lawyer, but whose writings are, the entire letter that this is in is 100 pages of analyzing his relationship with his father. Right. And he's insanely analytical. I mean, his creativity comes out of insane analysis. And he says, my not altogether hopeless analytical ability. I just burst out laughing. So,
well, a lot of people don't think of Kafka as funny, and he is often funny as well.
He's hysterical. He's hysterical.
Well, speaking of this dedication to a spiritual existence, you in your 50s, I've heard, dedicated or rededicated yourself in a different way to poetry. Can you talk about?
I did.
You didn't?
No, this is news to me.
Oh, really?
What did I do in my 50s? I'm 63 now. What did I do in my 50s? What did you hear? I love it.
I had heard that you had made some sort of pact with yourself. I mean, maybe this is just urban lore, right? Or rural lore.
Tell me. I want to know. Did
you?
I made a pact. What was the pact that I made?
That's what I was going to ask you.
Oh, you were going to ask me. You heard I rededicated myself to poetry and made a pact. Well, I have no memories, but it is true. Enormous life changes occur in your 50s. Midlife crises, that's not urban lore. It's real, and every one of you will experience it. And your priorities shift. Everything just shifts. And you have to decide what's important and make decisions and go with it. I think it was in my 50s that I gave up seeking full-time gainful employment. I did. I had pursued that for many years, and I stopped. I threw my cover letter out. I threw all the names, and I took myself off the job list. And I mean, for paid access to. I know that I did that, but.
Well, I can tell you where my imagination went.
Yeah, sure.
Speaking of letters, since you were talking about Kafka's letters, I was thinking of Rilke's letters on Cézanne that he wrote to his wife. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but he was really obsessed with what Cézanne did in the latter part of his life. And the way that Rilke saw it was a sort of renunciation of everything to become one thing, which was the final unification with his work. And Rilke wanted that desperately and seemed extremely tortured on how to get there.
It's a never-ending struggle, and yes, I suppose something like that happened. But I'm not alone. It happens to lots of people, and also in a wide variety of ways. It's fair to say that the first half of my life, my life's much more than half over. My life at one point was very compartmentalized, and I used to think about it. I used to ask friends, query them about their lives and the compartmental. And let me give you an example. When you're still living with your family, you have your family, but you have school, and then you have the private world inside your head when you're listening to music with earphones on in your room or whatever. You have your school life, your private life, and then you have your gang of friends, if you're lucky, And that private life in the head would also include reading, So your life is compartmentalized. At least mine was. I didn't tell my parents everything that was going on in the other aspects. And it continued to be that way for me for a very long time. And then eventually you enter into intimate relationships and you have partners and there's that. And then you get a job, but you still have the life of your mind. And you have a life in a community. My life was always felt compartmentalized, and it slowly became less and less compartmentalized. And I no longer feel, all our lives are compartmentalized to an extent, but I no longer feel sharp divisions. My life does feel unified. I feel, it's really hard to describe, but on Mondays in the laundromat, it's not a different part than if I'm doing erasure in the morning. It feels like it's just one unit of living, that I don't turn. My being a poet or artist doesn't get turned on and off. Mm-hmm. It doesn't get turned on and off. That's for sure. It's not something I do between the hours of X and Y. Yes. And that's a wonderful feeling. And it's why nobody should fear aging. Aging has negative aspects to it, obviously. But you should never fear aging because you have no idea the freedom. The absolute freedom inherent in aging is astounding and mind-blowing. You no longer care what people think. As soon as you become invisible, which happens much more quickly to women than men, there is a freedom that's astounding. And all your authority figures drift away. Your parents die. And yes, of course, it's heartbreaking, but it's also wonderfully freeing. They're always authority figures, whether negatively or positively. And you don't have teachers anymore, right? And feelings of insecurity or competitiveness, everything just drifts away in terms of what keeps, authority. You wake up and there are no authority figures. It's very freeing. Yeah, and no one's watching you. Very freeing.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Mary Ruefle, and you're listening to Between the Covers. To further this polarity between wonder and knowledge, you emphasize the importance of wasting time, and which is another way in which I think the enterprise of poetry is in opposition to the everyday current of like American culture of progress and building and constructing a life on a monument to to pass on to someone else. Can you talk about what wasting time is, and how that relates to poetry?
Well, I can only speak for myself, of course, but wasting time is my idea of absolute happiness. My idea of happiness is not the next person's, but my idea of happiness is to have an entire day where I have nothing to do and no desire to do anything, and that I just wander around. I've tried for a very long time, for a number of years now, to spend at least one day a week in which I do not turn the doorknob of my apartment. I do not leave for any reason. And that's always the happiest day of the week. It's not always possible. But I suppose for many people, their idea of happiness would be, oh, we have Saturday off, let's go to the opera or pack the car and go to the beach, or let's... my idea of happiness is to do nothing. My idea of happiness is to wander around. It could be I could just go out the door and take a leisurely walk and wander down. There's a river not far from where I live that I can walk along. It's very stony. It's more like a rushing stream. But to just be inside my apartment wandering around, and my mind will go from one thing to another. I find that wasting time allows me to be uber attentive, which is a state I love to inhabit. And so I just kind of cruise, and I'm not actively writing, but it's on those days that I'm doing nothing and wasting time that a piece of writing will it's inevitable that one will come out of it. Absolutely inevitable. It's the only activity I can think of in which the inevitable end result will be a piece of writing.
It reminds me, this idea of one day where you don't touch the doorknob reminds me of the spirit of the Jewish Sabbath, in the sense that you don't exchange money, you don't turn on any lights, you don't do anything that furthers your life in a.
I came close to converting when I heard when I learned more and more about all of that. I thought it was the most wonderful thing, that I'd ever heard. I love that idea of keeping the Sabbath, and we've lost all of that. I mean, even in Christianity, you couldn't buy anything on Sunday. The stores were everything shut down on Sunday, and the general population of this country, the demand was, no, we don't want that. We want life to continue as is. And for most people, staying home alone all day. I'm married, but I'm fortunate enough my partner enjoys. Actually is better at wasting time than I am.
Wow.
Yeah. And that can be alarming when you see someone's better with. But it's not boring to stay home alone and wander around and do nothing. And many American people, they have in their garage or their attic or a closet in their apartment, all these forgotten projects, endless projects. Well, when will I get to organizing this is terribly old-fashioned of me, but the photograph album, I suppose that's not a project for today's world. Or when will I, go through the books or the CDs, or when will I make that recipe that I've always wanted to make and never have? It's endless.
Could we hear Faster
Sure.
Love Is All There Is?
Oh, yeah.
That seems like a nice
segue
to that poem. I think it's in Trances of the Blast, actually.
So waste time is if you're listening, waste time. That's the artist's advice to you, is to waste time. This is called Faster Love Is All There Is. There is nothing faster than more faster love. Faster love is all there is. As it is 4:03 and life takes another amazing and distressful turn. as when a seagull picks up a French fry and becomes human. What are we to do at sea with our logarithms when faster love is all there is? When April has 46 days, after which it can't go on, floating on the mattress, so it rises so we can see the flowers it was once upon and a few strands of brownish hair. When we tiptoe down the hall for ice, when ice falls out of the chute and into the bucket, when a cube falls through the grate and is gone. When we huddle in our sea of cars, when we suffer muchly from glare in the face and keep the eyes alive with nothing more than an eyedropper. When we never went snorkeling, but nonetheless sensed people are more capable of floating by than any other creature. Stop, stop, pretty water, raise a cup of kindness to them. As it is, there's nothing faster. Faster, love, it's all there is.
You've been listening to poet Mary Ruefle. Mary, last summer at the Tin House Writers Seminar, you gave a lecture on, and part of the theme of the lecture was a growing alienation that you were feeling towards the upcoming generation of students, and particularly in relationship, I think, to their relationship to technology.
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And partly, I'm curious, do you feel like there's been a qualitative shift in relationships to technology, or is it a matter of degree around, say, electricity and the telephone and planes, for instance?
No, it has to do with the freedom of aging. It's directly related to that. I have nothing against technology per se. What I have is the right, as a private human being, to pay attention to what I want to pay attention to. And I choose not to pay attention to technology, except to a degree that is more limited than the average citizen. I have the right to say no. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying no for political reason. I could talk about it in those terms. Of course I could talk about it in those terms. I could talk about our government, having access to telephone records. I could talk about what happens to old cell phones when they're in piles in India and kids are picking up parts that have radio. I could go there. I don't want to go there because all that could be said about paper industry or whatever. So I'm not going to go there. It's just my right to pay attention to what I want to pay attention to. And I think we do live in a culture where the culture dictates what you're supposed to pay attention to. And many, many young people have always been under peer pressure, or at least since the rise of youth culture after the Second World War. But now more than ever, we're under some sort of cultural pressure to, what's the word? Stay wired, tuned, plugged in, network, that's the word, social networking. And things like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and I'm just not vaguely interested. I'm just not interested. That's my right, I have the basic human right to remain private and to pay attention to what I want. So if I want to look at a bug, pay attention to a bug that's crossing the table or the road, that's my right. And more the younger students in their 20s, they can't conceive of a life without social network. They can't conceive of it. I ask students to attempt to unplug one day a week. And for many, it's a life-changing experience, and they get it, and they like it. And for others, and I deeply respect this, they're very honest, and they say, I can't do it, I tried, I can't do it. So it just has to do with my right to privacy and to pay attention to what I want. I'm not on a crusade against it.
Well, let me ask you something that I was curious about from Madness, Rack, and Honey, a line that I really loved in your essay, Poetry in the Moon. You say, Neruda, in his poem Nocturnal Establishments, calls himself a surviving worshiper of the heavens, which is what many poets are, I think. Yet some say there are two things that call this into question: postmodern theory and technology, which are inseparable. What does that mean?
Well, postmodernism has many different tenets to it and is constantly changing. But one of the tenets of postmodernism is the idea of global village and interconnectedness and free flowing between genres. Okay, the breakdown of genres, the breakdown of demarcation in architecture. It's you throw all the styles together, right? In design, the central one way to describe the impact of postmodernism would be to say, what is the snowboard? Is it a ski or a skateboard? There's an example that you can see. Now, another interesting thing is younger students were born into a postmodern world. They don't remember the world before postmodernism. I do. And, okay, so it's this demarcation is gone. And technology has enabled that to an extraordinary extent, where the endlessly free-flowing information from all sides coming together. I don't know. I'd have to think maybe a little more, but I mean, technology and postmodernism came into being at the same time. They have to be related. They came into being in the 60s and 70s in small postmodern theory in France, in small pockets. It really didn't hit American campuses in a big way until the early 80s. And that's when personal computers were on the rise, and Steve Jobs was out there doing what he was doing to change the world. And so something was happening, the same zeitgeist was happening that formed these things simultaneously.
Well, I'd love to ask you a couple probably naive questions about poetry. I came to poetry late, and I came to writing and reading mostly through fiction and story, only later on into poetry. So forgive the questions if they seem obvious to you, but two things that struck me about poetry that I don't see nearly as often in narrative fiction are visual art as a topic of poetry, like this charge between poets who write about painting or write about seeing, and also a fascination with the non-human other, and even projecting one's consciousness both into animals and plants, but also into objects. And these things seem to be far less common in mainstream literary fiction to me. And I'm curious if that strikes you as true, and if you have any thoughts on why.
Well, that's interesting. I think it is true. Well, the first is true. Painting has always been a subject. Did poets fall in love with painting and they want to write about it? And painters fall in love with a poet. I mean, look at Cy Twombly, and they want to paint lines from Dante. So it works both ways. Artists love other artists and other genres, and so there's always going to be cross-fertilization there. Does it happen in novels? Well, maybe not as. I don't know. Look at Donna Tartt the Goldfinch. It's all about it's not. The narrative's not directly, but there's, characters obsessed with a painting. A painting is central to it. And you can, in Proust, you have that central motif of the piece of music that keeps occurring. It seems natural to me but I know what you mean. And it has to do with the fact that a painting and a poem inhabit a different time frame than a story. They are both momentary inhabitors of the moment, more than a story or novel or a narrative. So they would lend themselves to some of the same concerns. Stilled moment is there such a thing, I mean, time does pass in a painting if you're looking at it, but stilled moment, I'd have to go for stilled moment, probably cliched answer, but stilled moment. Now, for the other, inhabiting non-human other, oh, I love that. That's much more up my alley. I write more poems from that obsession than, I don't write a lot of ekphrastic poems. I didn't even know what that word meant until one of my students told me. Soseki, Japanese novelist, I Am a Cat, written from the viewpoint of a cat. That comes to mind. So it is done.
In fiction, it seems like it's done much more in fable and fairy tale.
Yes, Aesop's fables.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell our listeners what erasure is. I know you mentioned at the beginning that you at one point wanted to be a painter or a visual artist, and that this is really fulfilling that desire for you. Can you talk about erasure in that regard?
It's hard to describe, but you get it in an instant if you can see it. There are examples on my website. Yes, it's true. I have a website, computer. I take old, small, beat up for the most part, 19th century texts, and I take a jar of whiteout and I erase words on the page, leaving a select few to create new text. That's what it is. It's erasing text, but leaving some intact, words that you choose to create new text.
And you are erasing works that are not yours.
They're not mine. They're not famous. They're not books that are read anymore. They're very obscure, unread, unknown works. For the most part, there are a few exceptions.
How, if at all, does your process of erasure influence your creation of poems? Do you find that it changes the way you revise or the way that you see the words on the page when you're putting your own words on the page?
It never had any influence in the beginning. Well, I've done, I'm working now on my 78th erasure book. The erasure work for me is I'm making a physical object. It's one of a kind. It's a little book. It's full of color and images that I paste in or draw in. So it's making, it's a physical act of making something, and I really, really love that in my life. And I know that we make poems and that they're objects, but it's different. It really is different. So in the beginning, the answer would be no. But in the last, I want to say 2 years, I have been, most of the poems that I've written get their opening lines from a page of erasure. So increasingly, I'm using the text from an erasure book in my work. Suddenly they've become, once they're completed, they become, I suppose, what another poet would call their notebook, with scraps of language. I get those scraps of language from the erasure books. So in that sense, they're feeding. But in terms of arranging on a page, no, I'm very I'm a boring, ordinary poet. Formally, it's just blocks, and I know a lot of people complain about that, but I don't care. So no, I don't see myself moving to some open field space on the page because the erasures very much look like that. The spacing is all over the page.
So you intentionally choose 19th century works, not famous works, even though you have a resonance with Laura Richards as a writer.
Yes, but she's not read anymore.
Right. How is that different than when you wrote Minor Ninth Chord, the reduction of the Robert Walser story? Is how when you approach, I'm guessing a story that you had some admiration for, and you created a poem out of it.
Yes. I don't remember writing that. I don't remember what I did, but I can assure you I didn't take white out and erase the Walser story. I think probably what I did was I wrote down my favorite lines, perhaps, and then tried to combine them in some way. I know I didn't erase the story. I just used my eyes scanning. That I remember, but very little beyond that. And was I making erasure books when I wrote that poem? Beats me. I don't know.
I love your line that in every novel there's a story, in every story there's a poem, in every poem there's a haiku.
Yes, that's a fun project right there. Take a novel and write a short story from it, and then take a short story and write a poem from it, take a poem, turn it into a haiku. Things can be endlessly reduced. And I love all those forms. I love all of those forms.
With all of your play in your work and contradiction, I think that a lot of your poems can be read in different ways. And when I was listening to Ron Charles interview you, it seemed like he took a lot of these contradictions as tongue-in-cheek and with as witty and humorous. And when Matthew Dickman was talking about you a couple of weeks ago, he was saying, Mary Ruefle does not use irony. She means everything she says. So, but he also qualified that saying, but you'll probably contradict me on this. So I'm curious what role irony does play in your work, if any role in your mind.
I do mean everything I say, but I mean like all things, we do and we don't. I know for many years I would give readings and the audience would laugh. And there were many poems I read where I was made very uncomfortable by the laughter because I thought that the work was not funny. It was, if anything, was a bit sad. And then I had a friend, the poet Jack Myers, who is dead now, who said, he said, Mary, everyone processes and hears the, appropriate for their moment in life. And you can't control that. And you have to, let that go. And that helped. So I never, after that, I didn't mind. But then when I was reading the proofs for the selected, I was laughing out loud. Because I don't go back to my work once I just don't go back to it or read it. And when I was reading the proofs for the selected, I kind of got it, that I was funny. And I remember laughing out loud and saying, oh, this is very funny. I love humor. I have a terrific sense of humor. It's humor is really important to endurance and survival, let's face it. And it's inseparable from tragedy. And I want both comedy and tragedy in my work. I seek to, I not consciously seek, but they're all mixed up. But I think Matthew's, I know what he means when I mean everything I say, and I say what I mean. I'm not consciously trying to be ironic. I think in another essay I write about that moment when you're in grad school and you read Berryman and you read, Life, Friends is boring, but to say so, you're admitting you have no inner resources, whatever. But Life, Friends is boring. In grad students, it's important that they laugh and laugh and laugh. That becomes an in-joke. But in fact, everyone who knew Berryman said he didn't have a shred of irony in him. He meant that. And I can remember having the experience, probably in my 50s, where the profound seriousness and sadness of the boredom of life hit me full in the face. And I understood that line in the deepest, most serious sense. And that line I've never laughed at since. I guess it's easier to discuss this in someone else's work than my own. Well, you were at the reading the other night. I'll just talk publicly about this. I read a letter my great aunt Meal wrote, and it's not the first time I've read it. And the younger people in the audience laugh at it. There was laughter. That letter is unspeakably heartbreaking. heartbreaking. But many members of the audience find the repetition, because her memory is failing, is funny, the way she repeats herself. It's heartbreaking. It's sad. I want to weep, when I read that letter. And there's been laughter in more than once in audiences. But then again, they're young. And as she says in the letter, one day they too will be old. And one day they will have the same experience. And I know that is true. And so I totally forgive laughter on the part of young people. We're young and we hear the word breasts or bosom, and we all collectively laugh. That experience in grade school, it's perfectly natural. I'm not about to condemn that, but it is. I think it's a sad letter, and there was a lot of laughter.
And what about in terms of your own art right now? Is there an area where there is a lot of juice and passion more than another? Are you particularly...
Yes, I'm much more interested in making erasures and writing prose than poems. Poems, I don't think I have it in me to write a poem that's any different than any poem I've ever written before. It might change, but...
Does that mean you end up writing less poems?
No, because they keep popping into my head, and I wish it would stop. They keep popping into my head, and I don't want to write them anymore, but I keep writing them. And the stuff I want to do, I either don't have time or they're not popping into my head. It's very frustrating. I don't want to write poems anymore, and they just keep popping into my head. But I do, and I suppose I should use this moment to plug my new erasure book. Next week, a brand new, an erasure, only the second one, is being published in full color, art facsimile. I'm very excited about that, which means, unfortunately and sadly, it's prohibitively expensive because it's like an art book. And it's called Incarnation of the Now. That's the erased title. And it's C-Double Publications in Minneapolis, and only sold online through their website, and only 300 copies are being printed. But bad news, folks, it costs $50, which is expensive, but it's highly produced, and they're just a not-for-profit. They're not-for-profit, but that's what it costs.
And can we anticipate another book of essays from you eventually? And you have so many good ones that have come out since Madness, Rack and Honey.
No, because I had no intention I didn't write them for publication, and there is irony in this. But if you read the introduction, I don't like writing lectures, and I don't foresee another book of them. I'm not sure I would live long enough to. That's it's like 20 years of having to write them. And yes, I've written. There are two that I have that aren't in the book, but another book of lectures. No, there'll be another book of prose.
Another book of
my
prose.
next wave book will be prose in fall of 2017.
Well, maybe we can finish today with the poem Lullaby.
Oh, okay. I want to thank you for having me on K-Boo.
K-Boo.
K-Boo. Go K-Boo. I love Portland. I love Oregon. I want to move to Oregon, but I think I would live in a little community on the coast or something.
That sounds like a good idea.
Does that sound like a good idea?
It does.
Lullaby. My inability to express myself is astounding. It is not curious or even faintly interesting, but like some fathomless sum, a number the sum of equally fathomless numbers, each one the sole representative of an ever-ripening infinity that will never reach the weight required by the sun to fall. There is nothing on the ground to pick up and examine. It is too far back among the leaves to reach. And here I am walking idly, passing it from below, with only a faint breeze to remind me there's anything there, the merest rustle of which quiets me down to the point I am able to sleep at all.
It was a great pleasure having you on Between the Covers today, Mary.
Thank you so much.
We're talking today to the poet and essayist and erasure artist, Mary Ruefle. You've been listening to Between the Covers, and I'm David Naiman, your host.